Welcome everyone. Have you ever heard of Fawning response? You know how we always talk about the fight or flight response when we are stressed. Scientists have identified another response called fawning. So let's start with the basic. Our brain have this essential part called amygdala, which is like our internal alarm system. It's constantly scanning our environment for potential threats. When it detects something scary, it triggers our stress response. For a long time, we thought this response was limited to fight, flight, or freeze. But now we know there is the fourth option called fawn. The fawn response is all about people pleasing and appeasing others to avoid conflicts or danger. It's like when you are faced with a threat, instead of fighting back or running away, you try to make nice with the threat to stay safe. From a neuroscience perspective, it is super interesting because it involves different part of our nervous system than the other response. When we fawn, our body activates the ventral vagal circuit of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is part of our nervous system that's responds for social engagement and connection. At the same time, we might also activate the dorsal vagal complex, which is another old, more primitive part of our nervous system that can causes us to feel numb or disconnected from our body. Now you might be wondering why our brains would choose this response. Well, it is all comes down to survival. In some situations, especially in childhood or abuse relationship, fighting or fleeing might not be safe or possible. So our brain learned that the best way to stay safe is to please the person who is threatening us. This response can become so ingrained that we start doing it automatically, even in situations that are not actually threatening. It's like our brain gets stuck in fawn mode. We might find ourselves constantly trying to please others, ignoring our own needs, and struggling to set boundaries. From a neuroscience perspective, this makes total sense. Our brains are incredibly adaptable and they are always trying to keep us safe based on our past experiences. If fawning worked to keep us safe in the past, our brain is going to keep using that strategy even if it is not actually helpful anymore. The fawn response is closely tied to something called neuroception. This is our nervous system ability to detect whether situation or people are safe, dangerous, or life-threatening. When we have experienced rational trauma in the past, our neuroception can take a bit wonky. We might start perceiving normal social situation as threatening, which trigger our fawn response. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't being nice to people a good thing? And you are right, it can be, but the fawn response takes it to an extreme. We are not just being nice, we are completely disconnecting from our own needs and emotion to please others. It's like we are putting on a mask and losing touch with our true selves. This is where the neuroscience gets really fascinating. When we are fawn mode, we are actually altering our brain normal functioning. We are overriding our natural instinct and emotion to focus entirely on reading and responding to others. This can lead to a whole host of issues like chronic stress, anxiety, and even physical health problems. But here is the good news. Our brains are incredibly plastic, which means they can change and adapt. Just because you have developed a fawn response doesn't mean we are stuck with it forever. With the right support and technique, we can actually rewire our brain to respond differently to stress and perceived threats. One of the key ways to do this is through something called interception. This is our ability to sense and understand the internal state of our body. When we are stuck in a fawn response, we often lose touch with our own bodily sensation and needs. By practicing interception, we can start reconnect with ourselves and learn more recognize when we are slipping into fawn mode. Another important aspect of healing from a fawn response is learning to set boundaries. This can be really challenging for people who are used to constantly pleasing others, but it's crucial for our mental and emotional health. From neuroscience perspective, setting boundary actually helps to regulate our nervous system and reduce stress. It is also super important to work on recognizing and expressing our own needs and emotions. This might sound simple, but for people who have been stuck in fawn mode for a long time, it can be really challenging. Our brain have literally been wired to ignore our own needs in favor of others. Relearning to tune into ourselves takes time and practice, but it is so worth to do it. One thing that really interesting is how the fawn response can show up differently in neurodivergent individuals like people with the autism. Some researchers have found that what looks like a safe state is autistic individual might actually be a fawn response and vice versa. This has huge implications for how we understand and support neurodivergent people. Now I know we have been talking a lot about the negative aspect of the fawn response, but it is important to remember that it's not inherently bad. It's a survival mechanism that our brain developed to keep us safe. The problem comes when we get stuck in this mode and can't get out of it. From the therapeutic perspective, understanding the fawn response is super important. It helps explain why some people might struggle with things like codependency or have trouble asserting themselves. By recognizing this as a trauma response rather than a personality flaw, we can approach healing with much more compassion and understanding. For example, some people are looking at how the fawn response might be linked to certain pattern of the brain activity. They are using advanced imaging technique to see what happening in the brain when someone goes into fawn mode. This could potentially lead to new treatments or intervention in the future. There is some fascinating research being done on how the fawn response might be linked to certain health conditions. Some scientists think that the chronic fawning might contribute to things like autoimmune disorder or chronic pain syndrome. The idea is that the constantly suppressing our own needs and emotion put a lot of stress on our body, which can lead to physical health problems for time. One thing that's really important to remember is that the healing from a fawn response is not about never being nice or helpful for others. It's about finding a balance where we can be kind and considerate without completely sacrificing our own needs and well-being. From a neuroscience perspective, this is all about regulating our nervous systems and finding that sweet spot where we can safe and connected but also grounded in ourselves. A big part of this healing process involves learning to recognize our own internal cause. This might mean paying attention to things like our heart rate, breathing, or muscle tension. When we start to noticing this physical sign of stress or anxiety, we can use that as a cue to check in with ourselves and see if we are slipping into fawn mode. Another important aspect of healing is learning to tolerate discomfort. For people who have relied on the fawn response for a long time, the idea of potentially upsetting someone or causing conflict can feel terrifying. But from a neuroscience perspective, gradually exposing ourselves to those uncomfortable situations can actually help rewire our brain and make us resilient. It also super important to work on self-compassion. Many people who struggle with fawning tend to be really hard on themselves, but beating ourselves up for our fawn response actually just reinforces the cycle. Instead, we need to learn to treat ourselves with the kindness and understanding. This actually helps to regulate our nervous system and makes it easier to break out the fawn response. It also worth noting that the healing from a fawn response is not a linear process. Our brain have developed this response as a way to keep us safe. So it's natural that we might slip back into it sometimes, especially when we are under stress. The key is to patience with ourselves and recognize that every time we choose a different response, we are literally rewiring our brain. So my friend, that's the fawn response from a neuroscience perspective, how our brain adapts to keep us safe, even if those adaptations are not always helpful in the long run. So thank you for watching and see you in the next video.